Alrighty, it is now the top of the hour, and we're gonna go to our next session. For our next session, I'd like to welcome Andy Whittaker and Chris Tompkins from Rustici Software. Rustici Software is the expert in e-learning standards who provides software to improve compatibility across the learning ecosystem. Chris and Andy's presentation will be a version of Between Two Ferns, titled Between Two Standards, as they debate on SCORM versus xAPI and other e-learning specs. With that, I'll pass it over to you, Chris and Andy.
Thanks. We appreciate the opportunity, guys. Thanks for taking the time today. I know you've had a packed day of sessions, and this is one among them. So we're going to do our best and change gears a little bit here. Andy and I answer questions at Rustici every day under the banner, Ask Us Anything, really. And sometimes those questions are a little uncomfortable. And rather than dance around them, we thought it might be best to pick sides and just tackle those things head on. And I can think of no one better to answer uncomfortable questions than one of the most uncomfortable people I know, which is Andy Whittaker. I've brought Tim Candy along with us. He is actually one of the world's leading experts in xAPI. He was the first evangelist for the standard. When we started Project Tin Can many years ago, we brought Andy on board to reach out into the world and talk to them. Through that, he became one of the leaders at Watershed. He's built more xAPI systems with customers than many other people. He's seen the ins and outs. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce Andy here as we begin to pick at xAPI just a little bit.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And I will take on the honor of introducing Chris Tompkins, also quite an uncomfortable person to be around. Chris has the internal moniker, and sometimes he'll share this publicly, of considering himself being in the top 5 most non-technical SCORM experts in the world. As you can imagine, we work with a lot of developers, so there's laughs and chuckles that come along with that anytime Chris proclaims that to somebody. But all seriousness, he actually is, and so it'll be fun to have Chris on here to sort of argue the SCORM side of things. Personally, as Chris mentioned, I'm an xAPI advocate. I still am to this day. Anytime I have the opportunity to talk with folks about the Experience API and organizations that are looking to do interesting things with it, I always get excited to do that, so I appreciate the time today. One of the things I love about the Experience API is how kind of new and fresh it still is, whereas the SCORM standard is quite old, and in some cases people might think it is a bit antiquated. So I thought I'd kick off sort of my uncomfortable question to Chris in having him answer the question, how old SCORM is, and also why would anybody still choose to use such an old and some might argue outdated piece of technology?
A common question, and one that gets presented all the time. SCORM's age is actually its strength. And in tech, this is a weird moment where when we're trying to achieve interoperability, how do you do one set of work that can go out into the world most efficiently? SCORM is one of the things that is stable because it's been around so long and because it's used in so many places the same way every time. It's much like looking at the music industry and being disappointed that the MP3 is still around and old, but wow, the MP3 has enabled the music industry to record one song and send it out into nearly any music device on the planet. And that type of interoperability is something's value, and if it was constantly iterating and changing every 6 months, we wouldn't be able to use it without constant updates, with software not having the appetite for those type of constant changes. So SCORM's age is actually its strength, and while some people might look at that and view it as old, I think it's the thing that makes us smile about SCORM and it actually provides a whole lot of value. But, rather than focus on SCORM's old age, Andy, tell me a little more about the birth of xAPI. Is it infantile compared to SCORM?
Yeah, that can be an uncomfortable question that I get on this side of the house from time to time. But like Chris spun the the ancientness of the SCORM standard as a benefit, I'm going to do the same and make that same argument for the newness of the Experience API. So I know you guys have been working now with the specification for quite some time in the cohort. You may or may not know the whole history, but essentially at a high level, the Experience API was originally created by a small group of folks here at Rustici Software back in 2010, 2011. That project was known as Project Tin Can, which is a whole nother conversation to have about the confusing nature of the early names of the specification, so I won't get into that today. But around 2012, I was brought on, as Chris mentioned, to help evangelize the specification to our customers as well as to the broader industry. And so formally, the specification became a 1.0 on April 13th, or April, yeah, thereabout, 13th of 2013. And so if you look at the calendar, that's about 7 years compared to SCORM, which is, whatever, 20 years old. The newness of the Experience API, I think, is one of its greatest strengths, though. xAPI was, in many ways, a direct reaction to the limitations of the SCORM standard, and part of that being the fact that SCORM is confined typically to a learning management system and to traditional e-learning content. So with the Experience API, we're able to take this new modern RESTful web service API to apply it to any application, any device, Internet of Things, anything that you want to track. The Experience API is here to enable us to do those things. Again, it was in many ways a direct reaction to the limitations of SCORM and looking at other opportunities to provide learning and training to members of an organization or a team, getting beyond Flash, getting beyond the browser, moving into desktop simulations and truly mobile types of environments. I know that Chris gets this question from time to time, but speaking of some of the sort of legacy technology that's usually thought of when thinking about the SCORM standard, we all know that Flash is dead. We're getting those announcements and the heads up from the various browsers that we're using. But I'm curious to hear Chris's take on the death of Flash, mobile being not only just a buzz term like it has been for the last 5 years or so, but actually being embraced by organizations. How does anyone keep using SCORM when Flash is going away and the mobile environment is really starting to take off?
A great question, and it's one that I think is a common misunderstanding about SCORM. So much of early SCORM content was built in Flash. It was a useful tool at the time, but SCORM and Flash are two separate pieces of technology. And while they're commonly used together, you can wrap any web deliverable multimedia into a SCORM package. If it plays in a web browser, chances are very good that it can be part of a SCORM zip file. And while there are certainly a bunch of courses out there in Flash that are going to need love eventually, it doesn't mean that the SCORM portion of that wrapper is the problem. And in fact, SCORM can be one of the best ways to wrap up a course so that it plays the same way and tracks the same way. But if you change the substance of that course to HTML5 or some other more compatible versions than Flash, SCORM continues to shine, and it's not a limiting factor at all, and in some ways can be better as a part of that conversion process. The other thing I get is that SCORM doesn't work on mobile. I hear it all the time, and I think it's true that a SCORM course with Flash in it doesn't work on mobile, but as long as those devices have an active internet connection, we've seen all types of SCORM content run on all manner of web-connecting devices. With an active and reliable internet connection, mobile apps and mobile websites and all types of things can have mobile-friendly and responsive designs inside of a SCORM package, playing on those mobile devices in all manner of ways, including sometimes even offline. It's a possibility with SCORM and a little bit of extra work. And so while mobile is king, SCORM is serving that master. I can't help you with Flash. It's going to go away, and some people are certainly going to have to do some work inside their SCORM packages. But it's not SCORM that you hate. It's the content. And so I want to make sure that we always try to decouple the fact that Flash is dead. That is true. But Flash is something different than SCORM, and SCORM does work on mobile every day. But, speaking of packaging and launching courses, Andy, how does that work with xAPI?
So this is where I don't get too overly excited about talking about the Experience API in the context of launching content. As I'm sure you all can probably agree, as you started digging into the spec and looking at opportunities to apply it in different ways, it gets far more exciting once you start looking outside of the traditional learning system and the traditional way of kind of packaging content like we have been with SCORM and AICC over the years. However, in the early days of the development of the specification, it was quickly noted by the industry that the Experience API had a lot of promise in being able to track learning wherever it took place in many types of devices. But at the beginning, there was really a desire to introduce the Experience API into the context of a more traditional learning application. Now, this is an area that gets a little bit more uncomfortable until recently, and I'll talk a little bit, I'm sure Chris will press me on this at some point, about CMI5 and the things that are going on with that profile of the Experience API specification. In the earliest days, though, it was a bit like the Wild West when it came to packaging xAPI conformant content and launching that from an xAPI conformant LMS, for example. One of the most encouraging things, though, in the early days was the rapid adoption of the Experience API by most of the major authoring tools out there. Storyline was a very early adopter of the spec. Captivate, Lectora, Domino, all of these major authoring tools that a lot of folks use adopted the Experience API as an additional publishing standard from very early on in its life cycle. The challenge there, though, as some of you might already know, was that there were no guardrails or really any governance for the packaged xAPI content that we were producing in these early iterations of support in authoring tools. And so the challenge there ultimately came on the LMS side of things. As Chris has mentioned, SCORM, I'll be nice. I have words that I could use to talk about the standard in different ways, but SCORM has a very typically limited set of data that it is capturing. And so it's easy for an LMS to understand that data and know exactly what to expect from that SCORM package when it's launched from the LMS. In the early days of the Experience API, again, it was a bit like the Wild West. Authoring tools could really generate any type of statement that they wanted in any kind of order, and it made it really difficult for LMSs to adopt it. I think that's changing. I think we're going to see a lot more systems like the LMS, doing interesting things with the Experience API and supporting that type of content. It can absolutely do the things, even in its early stage, even its early days of packaged content, it can absolutely do the things that SCORM can do. It can generate that completion status, that pass-fail status, that score, the duration, and then obviously, as you guys know, lots of other interesting data can be generated from even just that traditional e-learning package. So one of the things that I'm curious to hear Chris's take on is, now that the Experience API, and it has from the very beginning, but with some recent push on CMI5 specifically, now that the Experience API can do a lot of the things that SCORM can do in a SCORMy sort of way, when are you going away? When is that standard just going to disappear?
So I think SCORM probably has 5, 10, 15, 20 years of life left in it, because it's solving that global problem of helping someone building a course say the thing that will play and track the same way in all of these different systems. And so the SCORM standard may disappear if something more useful replaces it. And that value has to come from the industry itself. And so SCORM, the standard, is able to solve these sets of problems for these sets of learning and training experiences, often things with a beginning, a middle, an end, and an assessment. And I think a lot of folks would look at this and say, well, if they do the same thing, why not use the one I already have? And that's really why SCORM is going to be here for a while, because asking an organization to go rebuild their system, rebuild every content in their library, everything that they touch for the sake of a new standard is almost a non-starter. And so I think over time, people might shift modalities of learning. They might try new things. They might even use different standards to do that. But to think that SCORM is just going to go away for the sake of something new, I don't think is a realistic vision in the short term. And so as the industry evolves and adopts these things, I think the future has a blend of both. And I think that blend solves a lot of problems really well. It really depends on the adoption rate in the industry. And so I can easily just ask the question, Andy, how many systems support xAPI exactly? Are there a lot of off-the-shelf items that can compete with the ubiquity of SCORM?
Yeah, so that's a harder one, obviously. As many of you guys know, on the Experience API side of things, it's difficult to compete with the ubiquity of the SCORM standard as far as the number of applications that support SCORM versus the Experience API. One of the interesting things, though, along those lines is the different variation of applications that will support the Experience API eventually and that do today. So that is a very exciting proposition. Off the shelf today, it's a little bit more difficult. You know, when I talk to organizations on a pretty regular basis who are coming in just maybe learning about the Experience API for the first time, they're reaching out to organizations like Torrance Learning and Rustici Software and a few others, asking for guidance. Where do I get started? I really want to, prove to my organization that this is a valuable piece of technology, and we can do really exciting things with it. And the direction that I tend to point people initially, which isn't always the most exciting for them, is use the technology that you have access to today. You're probably using an authoring tool that supports the Experience API. Maybe your LMS supports it. We're crossing our fingers. More and more LMSs, as folks like you start to demand that of your vendors, will continue to adopt the Experience API. We have some technology that can help sort of bridge that gap in the instances where the LMS might not support it already. And so, that's part of my story that I try to tell to folks that are getting started with the Experience API. Use what you have. It's going to get way more interesting as more and more different types of applications start supporting the Experience API natively. The proposition that we presented to the world when talking about the Experience API in the earliest days was this idea of a plug-and-play type of system where you can use best-in-class applications for whatever they're specifically designed to do, the best-in-class video portal, the best-in-class just-in-time delivery of performance support, anything you can really dream of. And as long as all of these things are supporting the Experience API, it's just going to plug right into that learning record store, and off we go. We get to learn all sorts of amazing things from the data that we're collecting. I think people are still wanting to move in that direction. Part of what I also hear from folks on a regular basis is how much they do not like the learning management system that they're using. It seems like every organization in the world is working on transitioning from the LMS they're currently using to something else. I hear that all day, every day. And with the SCORM standards so closely tied to the learning management system, as more and more people embrace their disdain for their LMS in some ways and start looking for opportunities to move beyond it, I'm curious to hear Chris's thoughts on how that impacts SCORM and maybe, how that impacts SCORM and where he thinks SCORM might live in a world where maybe more organizations are using fewer and fewer LMSs over time.
So it's a common question I get, and when I start to pick it, what about their current LMS or ecosystem is uncomfortable, there's some misplaced hate involved in there. Often these systems were birthed from a compliance need. Large organizations especially have a risk to their business of getting sued or penalties and fines, and the training of mandate is often how these things initially get rolling. But then we find that these organizations take that value and apply it to learning and training that makes the organization better. So it's often birthed from something that's a little uncomfortable, a little unwanted, and maybe a little regulated in a boring way. And they lump so many things into hatred of their LMS that's not SCORM related, that's not the LMS related. It's just the nature of doing these things in a weird way. And so from that, I think the LMS is a place where people log in and you're identified and you choose from a library of content and you play it. And most importantly, that leaders at an organization can look into it and say, here are what my people know how to do. And from a compliance standpoint, they might even have to go and vouch for that, which SCORM provides a great, well-worn, well-used, well-understood way to deliver a course that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and an assessment. I don't know that the world ever changes where we don't need to know things like Andy spent 63 of the required 60 minutes in this course and passed this quiz at the end with a score of 95. That's germane to learning, whether it's in the hallway or an old school Scantron sheet with a number 2 pencil or a modern e-learning course itself, regardless of standard. And I think that since SCORM does that around the world every day across hundreds of tools, that it's really the SCORM thing that allows people to move, that allows people to pull from off-the-shelf libraries or off-the-shelf authoring tools or transition to another platform because they can take their library with us and put it into another highly compatible system and have things hit the heartbeat the way that they need to as they make that progression. And so, until compliance goes away is one of the first steps people take into the e-learning industry, I'm not sure that SCORM is ever replaced or the LMS is ever replaced, although I'll admit that the name might change or the platform might evolve, and it probably can and will and should along the way, but it's not SCORM the standard's fault. SCORM is actually one of the things that they should hate least about their application because it is the thing that lets them in and out of many various use cases, scenarios, and situations. But speaking of compliance, since that seems to be the birthplace of most learning, Andy, talk me through if compliance is the thing, how do you report on the Big Four? How does xAPI deal with that type of compliance use case?
So the Experience API, as I mentioned before, didn't quite have its stuff together until somewhat recently. Again, those early days of the Experience API on the packaged content side of things was, again, the Wild West. Tools were doing all sorts of various things with the statements that they were generating. More recently, and you guys have probably come across this as well, we have had the development of CMI5, which is a packaging profile for Experience API conformant content. It really is an important evolution to the specification. It enables Experience API content to play much more nicely with the learning management system. And again, in striving, I think that one of the common themes to the Experience API, I don't know if it has it out for SCORM specifically, like it wants to replace it. I think Chris will argue that there is a home for both of these specifications, but there's more and more advancements in the past few years that are enabling xAPI to be the go-to specification for any and all of your training, and including that compliance training that just needs to run in a traditional LMS environment. So with CMI5, you're going to get things like a prescribed set of statements every time that package is launched from the LMS. The LMS is going to issue a launch statement. The content will issue an initialize statement. And then from there, you're going to get normal things like completion, pass, fail, score, as well as a bunch of additional data that you can actually cram into your normal xAPI package to get all sorts of additional insights from. So yeah, so speaking of compliance, Chris, as we get back into this, yeah, exactly. I mean, is SCORM only used for compliance? I guess that's one of the key things that some people ask. If you're doing compliance, you got to do SCORM. If you're going to do something else, you need another specification.
Yeah, so look, SCORM is one of the ways that most applications handle that type of compliance requirement because it's well understood, it's well known, it's well used, it's interoperable. But SCORM can be more than compliance. Out of the gate, SCORM typically tracks a progression through a learning experience. It's typically linear, beginning, middle, end assessment. It typically reports Big Four, time, completion, pass, fail, score. Those things are just core to learning, and it does those things really well every time. Even if it's perceived to be boring, it's very useful. SCORM, though, can track other things. SCORM can track interactions, which are individual answers to each question, and what type of question it was, and whether it was right or wrong, and many other things. SCORM can help you click this part of a picture or handle a multiple choice or multiple selection course. SCORM in its advanced versions, SCORM 2004, can handle some different types of nonlinear paths through content, something called sequencing and navigation. I'll be the first to admit this is where SCORM gets uncomfortable because in order to use some of those advanced features, you've got to become an expert in some of the more advanced additions. The first and most used version of SCORM is SCORM version 1.2. It does the Big Four pretty well, and it's used everywhere. But if you want to step up into some of the fancier parts of SCORM, you need to move into SCORM 2004, which is available in 3 different editions, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, with no backwards compatibility among them, and they don't really play nicely with SCORM 1.2 either. So yes, SCORM can be used for things beyond compliance, but it begins to add complexity to the situation. But that complexity is well adopted and well supported. Most LMSs outside of open source Moodle, as an example, that only supports SCORM 1.2 in some ways, but many sophisticated systems can handle the sophisticated version of SCORM, and that helps a sophisticated content creator build things that move beyond what the common misconceptions are for what that standard can do. But Andy, I've been listening, and you're talking about these different concepts that sound like a lot of work to get you where you want to be. Recipes, profiles, registries, libraries.
Yeah, so
what's up with that?
This is another area where in the xAPI space, you get to sort of eat a little bit of crow in the early days. Now that the specification has been around for a while, we're starting to get our footing when it comes to the word salad that Chris just shared. Things like recipes, registries, libraries, and profiles. The reason that we have some of these things, and I'll talk about each one of them a bit here, is that, again, in the early days, there were just not a lot of guardrails or strong suggestions or guidance within the specification itself as to how to track particular types of activities no matter where they take place. And so in the early days of the Experience API here at Rustici, we came up with this idea of what we called recipes. And so we have a few of these that have been on the website for quite some time. The easiest example of one of these would be the video recipe. So if I'm going to track a piece of video content on my video portal, then I should theoretically and hopefully be tracking that video experience the same way that any other person in the world would be tracking video experiences, using the same verb with the same verb IDs for play, paused, completed, those types of things. If we had everybody just implementing their own version of tracking a pretty standard experience like a video, when the time comes to bring all of that data potentially into a central LRS, there may still not be the right level of data interoperability between the data that's coming from all these different systems. And so again, recipes was sort of our first stab at that. Along with that came registries, and the registry that is still being supported by Rustici. There's maybe a more official one now, thankfully, that ADL has been managing for us. But that was just another opportunity for the xAPI community to come to an agreement on how we're going to track certain types of activities. And in the registry sense, it's about the components of the statement. You can establish a verb ID, and that verb ID can have a specific URI that points back to a definition on a web page, and again, influencing and encouraging rather the interoperability among data. Now with CMI5 as being such a prominent profile, more and more work is starting to shift towards profiles, and I think some more pedantic people would see some differences there between a profile and a recipe. I have a pretty simple mind and think about those things in similar ways. And so you're going to start to see, I think, more and more profiles coming about. And again, those are just ways for us as a community to begin establishing some guardrails and some guidance around how we are tracking certain things. And again, it's really all about, at the end of the day, data interoperability, making sure that the data that we're collecting from all these systems really fits well together, because we can track things in a bunch of different systems. So Chris, I guess one question back to you is, how does SCORM handle that? The idea of bringing in SCORM data from one system to another, the idea of sharing SCORM data from one system to another. Can you at least concede that the Experience API has one-up SCORM in that regard?
So it is one of the biggest and most uncomfortable frustrations with some heavy SCORM users is that while SCORM, the package and the tools are all very interoperable, SCORM content is expected to live inside of a single zip, and that zip must reside on the same domain as the player that wants to render and track it, and that the data from that launch will live in that LMS. And SCORM, the standard, doesn't have any outcome portability. What's happening with a learner's records are that LMS's gradebook to do whatever they want with. And while you can pack up a library of content and take it somewhere else, there's nothing in the SCORM standard designed to help you pack up previous results and take them somewhere else. And so while SCORM might be highly interoperable from a component's parts, from a data model perspective, often LMSs are doing strange things with SCORM results and creating their own tables, their own reports, their own way of visualizing that data, and how portable or interoperable that data is a case-by-case basis. But there's nothing that SCORM is doing to govern or help or assist in that. It's limited to content and package tracked by application. And that shared understanding is there between the person building the course and the person launching and tracking the course, but there's no shared understanding outside of that one ecosystem that learner lives in. And so, yes, data portability is something that during Project Can people were looking for, and something that xAPI enables in a way that SCORM can't handle. But if you're only in one system, it's highly useful, and it's very good, and it's very stable, and it helps big learning platforms track all manner of content inside one gradebook really effectively. So graded interoperability between systems, but there's no data portability enabled by SCORM or mandated on the other side. But you're able to make all these expressions, Andy. What is the value?
Yeah, I think the real value in the ability to express the level of expression that the Experience API enables us is that, again, it goes back to this idea of answering the limitations or addressing those limitations of earlier standards that have come before, SCORM, AICC, maybe LTI in the higher ed space. It really goes back to the promise of the Experience API, which is let's track learning wherever it takes place. if we start moving further down that road, imagination can start to run wild, and we can actually start applying the Experience API and the structure of statements to even unrelated types of activities to learning and training. You know, in the days that I was on the watershed team, and even in the early days of promoting the Experience API back in 2012, 2013, this idea of this holy grail moment where learning and development within an organization can begin compiling data from lots of different systems that it's using, and then pull in data from some other applications as well, possibly maybe on the business side of things. And with that, once all this data is in a consistent format, living in maybe the learning record store, or eventually ported into a BI tool or a learning analytics platform, we can really start looking at the relationship between learning and development and performance of the business, or risk assessment, or whatever it is that you're interested in understanding how learning, training, even maybe compliance is impacting certain areas of the organization. And that's the thing that I still get very excited about. I'm happy to talk about the things that Chris and I have chatted about today, around how there's maybe some parity between xAPI and SCORM, maybe xAPI leapfrogs SCORM as far as ubiquity in those spaces. But the real excitement for me still comes from this opportunity that's in front of us. With that, I know that Chris and I can go back and forth all day about these things. Like he mentioned, this is our job. This is the thing that we actually get paid to do for a living to a large degree. And so it's easy for us to go back and forth. In conclusion, from my side, I continue to argue that there is a home for the Experience API in every organization. And I encourage folks like you who are within organizations yourself or working with clients to continue to push for more movement in that direction. I think the upside is so big with leveraging the Experience API that we can learn so much from the data that we can capture from all sorts of different activities and applications, that the promise is so great, that I want us to continue as a community moving in that direction. So we always tell folks, rattle cages, talk to your vendors, get them to adopt, don't take no for an answer, be a problem in some cases for them. The more adoption that we can get, I don't know how close we ever get to the ubiquity of the SCORM standard, as Chris has described, but the more that we can make this an ecosystem of a plug and play type of environment, the easier it will be for all of us to take advantage of this particular advancement. So with that, Chris, I'll let you kind of wrap things up from your side.
Sure. So I've obviously intentionally taken the side of SCORM, but I actually don't take sides in my real life here. We needed this as a way to kind of stretch on each other, but ultimately, this is a tools discussion. And for me, as a guy who helps two e-learning systems play nicely with one another, and that's all Andy and I really do all day, SCORM, AICC, xAPI, PENS, LTI, QTI, there are a lot of standards out there. And for me, it's like arguing over the screwdriver, the socket, and the wrench in my toolbox. They all turn a threaded bolt. We should use the newer one, or I really like the way this one feels, so I'm going to go use that. Those aren't good reasons to pick a tool for the job. And so let these standards serve their own merit. SCORM has some certain strengths. SCORM has some certain limitations. xAPI juxtaposes those really well. And as a total learning solution for an ecosystem, I think we end up with a blend of both of these things. But doing one for the sake of using it can often be more work. It can be expensive compared to just doing the thing that goes. And so if you want to have those type of debates, if people, while you're working on an xAPI project, present uncomfortable questions to you, ask them to us. We get them all the time, and I don't really think it's appropriate to ignore them or to dance away from them, but instead we can often use those as moments to reframe an idea, reframe a project, or grab a better tool. And so I'm grateful you guys hung in there with us today. I hope you have some better answers to some uncomfortable questions that people on your team might ask you. And for those remaining ones, we're happy to address them now, or you can reach out to us at any time. Ask us anything really is what Andy and I do all day, and we're here to help.
Thanks, everyone. I know that there was one question that we were seeing in kind of the back channel here. So I wanted to just touch on that real quick. I know we're out of time. CMI5 adoption is rapidly expanding. I think when we first were starting to sort of report on those things within our SCORM Cloud application, we were only seeing, in the earliest days, about 4,000 CMI course launches back in even like October of last year, even to that degree. Since then, over the last 12 months, we've seen an increase of 233% just in SCORM Cloud alone. So I know that we're going to get a lot of that content coming through SCORM Cloud, but hopefully more and more demand is going to be out there for the CMI5 product or profile, and I think that's just going to further encourage adoption. So I know time's up. I'm seeing the red light, so we'll kick it back over to the leaders here and let you guys get on with your day.
For sure. Thank you so much, guys. Great debate. I'm going to switch over to the evaluation here. Please feel free. Let us know what you thought. Let us know what side of the debate you might fall on.